And joining us now, Mike Miner with Professional Ag Marketing, just getting back off their crop tour here last week. Mike, good to catch up with you, man. How are you?
I am doing well, better in the office now, and better after this rain over the weekend.
Yeah, I want to touch on that here in a second. That rain really hitting some key areas of the Central Corn Belt here over the weekend, and may have really helped out some growers in the region. But just to start, I want to talk about your guys' crop tour. I know two different routes you guys had, kind of a western route and an eastern route. If you want to divvy it out that way, I'll pull them up on the video screen. But
Yeah.
just talking about this, I know I think you had the bit longer route, Mike. Overall, I know you guys done this a couple of years. I mean, overall, what are your thoughts? Better than expected, worse than expected, pretty much in line. I know we'll break it down more, but just
Yeah.
general nationally, what did you think?
Yeah, so we had the southern route on that. We kind of worked our way south through Nebraska first and then over to Ohio and back. And then Lucas Peters out of our office, he did the northern route and just wanted to touch base a little bit more localized, really dive into some numbers more between Minnesota, South Dakota, and North Dakota. And just like any crop tour, you can pretty much look at a drought map and you know what you're going to see when you go into it. I would say the key observations for me are, the big question this year is, can the Eastern Corn Belt make up for the Western Corn Belt's shortfalls? And it's a really tough answer out of the Western Corn Belt because how bad is bad out of Nebraska, right? It's going to be a really tough state to put a number on this year. Um, with it being irrigated a lot of the state, that's going to help out some. But obviously, the dry land is going to start really hurting us on that yield. So it's really tough to try to peg the Nebraska number. And that's going to be the one that I can move more than any of the other numbers. Now, when we moved into Missouri, I would argue that, the largest corn producing counties in that state are in the north, which is still fine compared to the dryness they had in the south. So we didn't touch too much into it. We tried to a little bit south of Miami there, but didn't find anything too stressful quite yet. And then Illinois was very interesting, I thought. So the eastern part of Illinois, kind of the drought map between Illinois and Indiana there when we had a little bit more stress towards the end of July. That area was a little bit more disappointing than what I thought the perfect ice states looked like going into the tour. And I don't know if it was exactly the late planting that contributed to a little bit of poorer results than what I had seen out of those stops in the last few years. I noticed it a lot in Indiana and then into Western Ohio as well. The few people I talk with out of Columbus, that area was fine, but Western Ohio was just too wet all year long. And as we wrap back north on that start of the crop tour, I started to see some really impressive stuff probably about halfway through Illinois. And when we got up the northwestern side of the state, that's where I saw what I would call a record crop from basically there up to, Albert Lee type area, central Iowa. And then when I got back to about Bancroft there in Iowa, that's where I started to see more dryness kind of taking over, a little bit lighter soil. You could start to really tell by that point. But that stretch, I would call as probably the ice state, the wonderful corn crop they had talked about going into it. But between Illinois and Indiana, I was a little bit disappointed. It's not a bad crop by any means, but it maybe wasn't quite as good as what I would have hoped for average crops out of that area.
Now, I was looking through your guys' analysis from the tour. One thing that stood out to me a little bit, we've been hearing more and more about dryness in Southwest Iowa, but you guys found some pretty decent looking corn in
Mhm.
Southwest Iowa that, I mean, who knows what it'll look like here as we move through. Will test weights come down if we stay dry? But that stood out to me as one area. And then to your point as well, kind of that north, far west, north central, northwestern Iowa starting to see a little dryness. But then, we'll touch on the rain there in a second. But those were two things that really stood out to me from your guys' tour, Mike.
Yeah, so like York, Nebraska, I would argue that that area there they had some hail damage and stuff from earlier, but more minute stuff, not really relevant on the drought map at all. And when we worked into Southwest Iowa there, The Potawatomi area is a spot that always looks pretty good, and that looked exceptional this year. Very consistent corn. Some of the counties around it were a little bit more stressed, but I found really good corn going through that area. Will it be as good as last year? Maybe not quite, but I think it still has a very good chance at a good crop there, especially if they can catch some of those key rains. So I didn't see too bad of stuff down there. There's spots. If you go to a lighter area with some drier soil, you'll see it. But the really hard um, corn production high counties in the United States are what we targeted. So we try to hit the 20 largest corn production counties in the United States. And those, from what we saw, the Illinois, Indiana ones were a little bit more below average or right at average. And that was a little bit on the bottom side of my expectations. Eastern Iowa was awesome. And then, that York, Nebraska was still fine. And I thought Southwest Iowa there, that county produces a lot of corn and they're still going to have a pretty good crop.
Well, now looking at the weekend rains we saw, Mike,
Yeah.
we got to think about that. Some of those areas that were starting to get a little stressed, basically draw a line from Sioux Falls along the Iowa Minnesota border to, parts in southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois. I mean, you're right in the heart of that. I mean, we've seen reports 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 inches of rain in some
Yeah.
spots. So after you took the crop tour and now seeing this rain, what do you think that's going to do for the corn crop in that area, which is a very key corn production area in the country?
Yeah, so the 4 bushels they took off initially for late plant dates are going to be really hard to get back, I would argue. So now that we got this rain over a good chunk of the areas that really needed it, I'm in Sioux Falls. We farmed just north of Sioux Falls. We got 2.5 inches of rain. That was from God above. That was what we really needed to keep the crop from going backwards. Now, is it going to add a lot onto the crop? I don't know how much it'll help finish it out. It's going to help, but I wouldn't say yield's necessarily going to go up dramatically from here. It probably just keeps it from going down much further. And I think that was the key point. Northwest Iowa included. I know it was a little bit more spotty down there, but they don't need a whole lot of rain to make a crop down there either with that good soil. So
Well, overall national yield that you guys found after compiling all your numbers, 176. That's pretty much in line with what USDA's at. And I would have to agree. Everything I saw from your tour and everything I'm hearing from other folks, that seems like that number's pretty attainable. As you look at that number nationally, Mike, I mean, barring something crazy, I don't see. I think that's a pretty solid estimate that you guys came up with there, that 176 mark, as we head towards final yield numbers.
I think so. Iowa's the one that carries the big stick here, and I just have a really hard time looking at the drought map and seeing last year's corn crop they were able to pull off. And for us to pull it under last year's yields is really tough for me. So that one I think is a solid hold. Nebraska's all over the board. It's not 2012, but is it the 190 the crop they've got used to? Probably not either. So it's going to fall somewhere in between those. So that one moves the most, I would argue. And then Minnesota, they've caught a lot of good rains. I know it's dry up by Marshall. They found some drier stuff. They were a little bit better than last year. So I think the Minnesota one is solid as well. The Dakotas, at late plan up in North Dakota, pulling that back a little bit. The stuff that is there looks good. South Dakota, I don't know how much that southeast corner of the state is going to matter for an overall state yield. I know the drought map looks better this year for South Dakota, and our stuff will be. But we are chopping some fields south of Sioux Falls here, not very far. So that line from about Sioux Falls down to about halfway through Nebraska is going to be really the disaster zone that we've got to watch closely. But other than that, I would say average to just below. And that's kind of why we kind of came up with that 176 number. And to get much either side of it, like you said, we're going to need something major to change, I think, going forward.
Well, Mike, before we run out of time as well, coming up this week, Friday, we got an August WASDE report. I know we're going to have those resurvey numbers from the Dakotas and Minnesota as well. And you mentioned a late plant up there. Uh, any thoughts with just what we could be looking at with that report coming up on Friday, or just any thoughts for producers to keep in mind with their marketing strategy? I'd have to think maybe trying to play a little defense here ahead of the report might be smart.
Yeah, definitely. I would say going into Friday, you're going to be looking at the first time NAS will be doing it this year for the WASDE yields. So that'll be a big one. They're taking field surveys and then farmer surveys. So it'll be the first time they get that grouping of numbers at all. It's not associated with the last month's numbers or organization. So keep that in mind when they come out. The maturity wise is a little bit behind normal. So they're going to find some more immature corn on the trip, which we'll see if they come out with any notes on that, looking for the resurveys as well. And then, as defense going into this report on Friday, we've really started to really try and hold at this $6 mark on December corn. It's chopping sideways. You look at a chart like 2008 has a really strong correlation with a year like this year. We did get a pretty major sell off by the end of that year. So for us to come out here and say that there's solid support at this area specifically, it's tough when we're talking about recessionary type time frames, and with money flow with what it's done. There's still a bundle of long positions out here that can be exited. I would just play a little defense. There's some short dated options that can get you through August, pretty relatively cheap, especially if you're a little bit more on the lower sold side. So I'm going to entertain some of those options a little bit. And basis, watch that. Soybean basis fell off really hard recently. Corn could be soon after. Once a guy gets enough to get to new crop, I would look for them to pull out of that market pretty aggressively.
Yeah, I think cash always kind of tells the story what's going on in the countryside. So watching
Yep.
that very closely and definitely watching as we head into Friday's report. Mike, before I let you go, I should mention as well, we got to give ourselves a plug. Dakota Fest coming up here next week and on Wednesday the 17th. I know you or Pat, one of you guys, going to be joining us for a market discussion there at 1 o'clock on Wednesday. Looking forward to having you there and talking about a lot of different things going on in the market trade right now.
Can't wait.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. And that's coming up Wednesday, the 17th, during Dakota Fest in the Reeves Education Center, 1 o'clock. And we look forward to seeing you there. Mike, always appreciate the time, sir. We'll see you in Dakota Fest next week. Have a good one.
See you next time.